Okay. Today is Tuesday, April 5th. Um, we're going over Genesis 27. Today will be the last day of recording it on an off time. And class will start up again this coming Monday. Um, again, I'm here by myself, and the washer's going, so hopefully that doesn't get caught on the recording too much. Um, but chapter 27, kind of a long chapter, but a lot of it is a little bit repetitive, and so uh, we won't linger on stuff for crazy long. Um, so we left off with the story of Isaac and Abimelech. Um, and the last thing we were told was this little kind of uh, parenthetical statement about Esau um, marrying the Hittite women and that making life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. Um, so now we have a pretty famous story of where Jacob is going to trick Isaac into getting his Esau's blessing. And this has massive ramifications down the line. Um, and so yeah, let's just get into it.
7. When Isaac was old and his eyes were dim so that he could not see, he called Esau his older son and said to him, "My son." And he answered, "Here I am."
Okay, so I can't. So there's a couple of things here. One, we'll end up talking a little bit about timeline, actually, a bunch. I don't know when I'm gonna do that. Um, but it says when Isaac was old. So how old is he? Um, he's about 140 here. Um, the context of the story makes it really seem like he's about to die, but in actuality, he's not about to die. He's gonna live for like another 40 years after this event, roughly. Um, we also have this line about his eyes were old and dim. And I don't think you're supposed to make a connection between these two things because the language is different between them. But I end up thinking about whenever the reference to Leah uh, about her eyes being weak, and that's supposed to be like a euphemism for that, like she's apparently not attractive or something like that. Um, but the language in the Hebrew is definitely different between the two passages. But they're the only kind of references to weakness of eyes or eyes not working well. And I think it's interesting of how those kind of go together. Um, but one of the ideas that I have about this passage is, and the questions that I have that's kind of in the back of my mind and that I haven't settled on is Isaac's um feebleness and the weakness of his eyes, is it intentional or not? And we'll see some verses later on for why I kind of half think that maybe it is, but also I think that it's maybe not. So it's weird. Is this blindfulness willful or not? Kind of is the question. But we also have the "Here I Am" motif, um, which that motif goes back to the garden story of the Ayeka. Where are you? Here I am. Th- that call and response. We have that same thing with Abraham being like Abraham, where are you? Here I am. Um, And what we're gonna see is um we're gonna see the degradation, right? So we've had this ongoing story about the degradation, the falls of humanity, right? And God's plan is to bring redemption to the whole world through this remnant seed, and he's going to bring them back up. But what you're going to start to see is that even in that remnant seed, that remnant family, as it's growing up, there's degradation within that family itself. And so even that family itself is going to need redemption, right? And this is going to get played out later on as Israel will need a redeemer. Not just as the whole world need a redeemer, but Israel needs a redeemer. And so we're going to start to see that I really see this story as the sins of the father are going to get played back against the father in this story. Um, we'll talk about that more.
He said, "Behold, I am old. I do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapons, your quiver, and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me, and prepare for me delicious food such as I love, and bring it to me so that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die."
Okay. We're gonna see throughout this chapter. So I talked a little bit about this previously, but the distinction between blessing and birthright, we talked about that with the birthright chapter, about whether or not there is a distinction. It's very murky to me because some of the scholarship in studies that I showed tried to say that, oh, well, it's a reconfirmation, and yes, there does seem to be this idea of a reconfirmation of the same thing, right? And I tied that to the covenant stuff that God does and blessing and reconfirmation because he repeats the covenant to successive generations. But we're also going to see in this chapter um, the idea of thinking that the blessing is something fundamentally different from the birthright, but we don't necessarily know what that difference is. Um, But there is also this idea of that food is tied to the blessing. You're going to see that continually, and we see it right here that bring me the food that I love so that I may eat, that my soul may bless you. Right? There's this idea that he needs the food in order to bring about the blessing. And it's not only Isaac that thinks this, pretty much everybody in the story thinks that this is the case. Um,
Now Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to his son Esau. So when Esau went to the field to hunt for game and bring it, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, "I heard your father speak to your brother Esau. Bring me game and prepare for me delicious food, that I may eat it and bless you before the Lord before I die. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice as I command you. Go to the flock and bring me 2 good young goats, so that I may prepare from them delicious food for your father, such as he loves. And you shall bring it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies."
okay, so again, Rebecca kind of repeats um, what Isaac says, but she has the same. She seems to have the same assumptions that um, Isaac does. Um, Also, this is where we kind of get the idea that or this idea for this scheme kind of ultimately rests with Rebecca. Um, and there's also in this story the idea of kind of playing favorites with the kids, and kind of showcasing that Rebecca really does seem to be playing favorites. Um, uh, Part of the reason why I think that little parenthetical statement prior at the end of the last chapter is there is to show that it's not just that Rebecca has positive reasons that Rebecca likes Jacob just because Jacob is inside more and cooks and is more like her, if you will. But is also that Rebecca doesn't like Esau's wives. That seems to be kind of the underlying thing that's going on here. But that brings about a really big question, which I guess we'll talk about now, which is timeline. When exactly is this happening? And should we take that parenthetical statement that happens at the end of the last chapter as saying when this story is going on? Well, to highlight the problems with that, I am going to bring up a chart. Um, okay, so screen sharing. Okay. Okay. So this to me, this chart right here just really highlights a lot of the issues with taking the years as exact literal numbers. Because whenever this is what this chart does, right? It takes a bunch of the years and maps them on as best they can to where everything is. The problem is that you lose so much of the thematic elements of the stories and the way that it talks about things if you take these numbers as straight literal. So what are some of the issues? One, look at the relationship between the birth of Jacob and Esau um to when Abraham dies. There's a good 20 years there. For reference, this time span right here of Jacob and Haran, that's a 20-year period, right? So that's a good 20 years here. So you definitely have an implication that if you're going to take these directly, that Jacob and Esau know Abraham and are alive whenever Abraham is alive. But we don't get any indication of that in the story. Also, Jacob and Esau are twins, and so they're the same age, right? And so if this story is happening after the marriage, right, which is there, um and so this story is happening somewhere within all of these aspects. um that means that the story from last chapter about Abimelech is happening somewhere in here. Here's my problem with that. One of the things that's happening in the story with Abimelech is it's supposedly been a long time since the days of Abraham and all of those wells get filled up. But the days of Abraham are kind of overlapping, and we don't have any indication that Isaac leaves that territory. Isaac basically always stays in the south. Um and so when are those wells getting refilled? It doesn't it really, the way the story and the structure of Genesis goes, it really makes it seems like, it's like Abraham gets married, boom, dies, then births happen, and then is away from the land stuff gets filled in after a while. Like it seems like there's a lot of like clear jumping over of things, but there's a ton of overlap here. Here's the other major issue. These are the descendants, generations from Noah to Isaac. Here's Isaac. Here's birth of Jacob and Esau. Here's Eber and Shem, right? So you're going to end up having like again, like thematic issues, and I talked about this previously whenever I talked about Abraham and the life of Abraham, of one of the things about the idea of Abraham living to a good old age, and you're going to have that with Isaac too, that he lives to a good old age. Not really. Not really in comparison to even contemporaries that are living at the same time as them. Like this is so what? So father, grandfather, great grandfather, great great grandfather, great 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 grandfather, great 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 grandfather, five greats, great 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 grandfather, six greats, like living at the same time as them. And this one's right. So five, six, seven, eight greats. Shem is still alive. Like the name where they get uh Shemitic, like an anti-Semites, right? Semite comes from Shem, living at the same time as them. And actually, this is a thing that oddly enough is going to get picked up on and noticed in later Talmudic and rabbinic Judaism. And that's why I have this thing here from Rebecca. The Talmud adds that Jacob spent 14 years in the yeshiva of Shem and Eber before proceeding to Laban and arrives at the age of 77. So, a yeshiva is a Jewish school. So this is clearly an anachronism by the Talmud. The Talmud, by the way, in rabbinic Judaism comes about after Christ. Comes about between 200 AD and 500 AD, is whenever the Talmud kind of like gets written, and is by Jews that are not living in Israel, and definitely engaging in an anachronistic practice by saying that Jacob went to the yeshiva of Shem and Eber. Shem and Eber no way had a Jewish school. But even with the dates that are in there, you have the idea of Jacob arriving to meet Laban whenever he's very old, like 60. Which, as you can see by this graph, matches up, which is not the thematic idea that we get. We definitely get the idea that the outgrowth of this story is that Esau chases Jacob away, and this is kind of happening whenever he's like young, and all of this stuff is happening when they're young, but it's really not. It's kind of happening whenever he's old. I think that was it. I think that's all I had to say about the weird. So just understand that there's weird timeline stuff going on, but that weird timeline stuff, in my opinion, shouldn't take away from the thematic lessons that the scripture's trying to teach us here. Okay.
But Jacob said to Rebekah his mother, "Behold, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I am a smooth man. Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be mocking him and bring a curse upon myself and not a blessing." His mother said to him, "Let your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my voice and go, bring them to me."
Okay. So again, we have this. I mean, even Rebecca is kind of setting up this scenario that it's going to be my fault This isn't going to be your wrongdoing, Jacob. This is going to be my fault. And you have this idea of blessing versus curse now. And again, it's not super clear, but Rebecca seems to think that like she can take the curse in place of her son. Whether that or not that's a legitimate thing that can or can't happen, and how ancient Israelites would have seen and viewed this, I don't know 100%. But that is an interesting idea that she seems to think that she can just like take it, and so the wrongdoing will be on her and not on Jacob. But we're going to see Jacob actually does do some things that I think are legitimately his wrongdoing and are his alone.
So he went and took them and brought them to his mother. And his mother prepared delicious food, such as his father loved. Then Rebekah took the best garments of Esau, her older son, which were with her in the house, and put them on Jacob, her younger son. And the skins of the young goats she put on his hands and on the smooth part of his neck. And she put the delicious food and the bread which she had prepared into the hand of her son Jacob. So he went in to his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am. Who are you, my son?" Jacob said to his father, "I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Now sit up and eat of my game, that your soul may bless me."
Okay, so we're seeing that reversal now, right? We're seeing that reversal of identity. And remember, Abraham and Isaac both kind of did this trick to others. They did it to Abimelech, for their own protection and for their own gain. And now we're seeing this reversal of in disguising of identity is now being played back against them, right? Jacob is now doing that and playing it back against his father. And he's doing it again for I don't know if you could say protection, but you could argue protection, because he wants that birthright blessing combo or not combo, however you want to think about it, solidified to himself. But he's definitely doing it for gain. And he's definitely doing it to be putting himself above Esau, who's his firstborn, right? And it is also Esau. It is also interesting that he says he doesn't just say I am Esau. He says I am Esau, your firstborn, right? Implying that birthright that birthright exchange that happened between them, it is still connected to this blessing. This blessing is somehow connected to that birthright. That's why Jacob frames his lie as I am Esau, your firstborn, because Isaac still seems to be thinking of that firstborn, or he thinks that Isaac is thinking of that firstborn being the one that gets the the big blessing, or right.
But Isaac said to his son, "How is it that you have found it so quickly, my son?" He answered, "Because the Lord your God granted me success."
Okay, this portion right here, in my opinion, that is Jacob's big sin in all of this. Um, what Jacob, like Rebecca didn't tell him to say that. Nobody told him to say that. He could have said something else here. He could have just said, "I was very fortunate and found and found some quickly," right? Or he could have boasted about his own skill. But what he does here is he uses the faithfulness of God and Isaac's own devotion, right? Because it says the Lord your God, Isaac's own devotion to Yahweh against him. He uses he uses the faithfulness of God to aid in his own sin. And in my opinion, that is one of the worst things that you can do, actually. Um, I actually think it is almost very akin to it's almost like blaspheming in the Holy Spirit, and uh it's akin to where Jesus says making the little ones stumble, right? It's because you're using you're utilizing their own faithfulness to God um against them. And that is a really terrible thing to do. Um, Part of that said, to make sure that my theology is straight here, part of the reason why I think it's forgiven to Jacob is because um, Jacob is not a leader at this point. Jacob is like he's not really a prophet. He's not a leader. It's before a lot of that um, happens, and so I think that's part of the reason why uh, he gets away with it here. But personally, I think that's one of the worst things that Jacob does.
Then Isaac said to Jacob, "Please come near that I may feel you, my son, to know whether you are really my son Esau or not." So Jacob went near to Isaac his father, who felt him and said, "The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau."
Okay, so we already have this idea that Isaac seems to not be convinced that Jacob is Esau, right? And we don't see this previously because earlier in the chapter, Isaac has a conversation with Esau. He doesn't seem to have this. He doesn't have this mixed feelings later, but he he's like, "Oh, I don't know if this is correct. So come closer to me and let me really find out."
And he did not recognize him because his hands were hairy like his brother Esau's hands. So he blessed him. He said, "Are you really my son Esau?" He answered, "I am."
And so we have that same kind of repetition that this is the corruption of the I am statement right here. And we start off the chapter with the like, where are you, Esau, my son? Or like, he goes right because he says, my son. And Esau answers, here I am. And now he's going, are you really my son? And it's not his son answering with, I am.
Then he said, "Bring it near to me that I may eat of my son's game and bless you." So he brought it near to him, and he ate. And he brought him wine, and he drank. Then his father, "Come near and kiss me, my son." So he came near and kissed him. And Isaac smelled the smell of his garments, and blessed him, and said, "See."
Okay, I'm going to pause it right before the actual blessing. I don't think it's a coincidence that the blessing is tied to Isaac smelling him. Um, there's a lot of stuff in so this is kind of a pattern that I want you guys to be aware of as you're reading Old Testament scriptures. Is that there's a pattern of um offering sacrifice blessings um and those sorts of things being tied to pleasing aromas, right? And you have this idea of like God smells the pleasing aroma of the sacrifice. And so this combination of like the food and the smelling of his garments, of both of these things acting together to be the thing that uh makes it so that Isaac imparts the blessing, right? Um, and you're going to end up kind of seeing this pattern play out later with uh, when you go into the temple, you wear certain clothes you do certain things, you offer the sacrifices, and that opens up a path for like imparting the blessing. Um, I think that there is a a tie to this with character and with how we uh even act with God today. There's an idea of right. If a situation smells fishy, right, it smells bad, right. It's like something bad is going on. Um, but you can also have a situation where like stuff like smells good and like it that there's good character. Uh, you can even you'll sometimes hear people like in business deals say something where they'll say like it passes the sniff test or something like that, where they're like everything's on the up and up, everything's good. Um, and so what I'm trying to say is that I think these sort of patterns and themes, we still have these in the modern day, and we also have them in the New Testament, and they kind of direct how we should act towards God, right? We get new garments, we get clothed in His righteousness. You have these ideas, and uh, by having good character, right? That's not how you get saved, but it is how like blessing can be imparted on you, right? You getting saved gets you the garments, right? In a salvific sense. So I'm not saying that like you need to be good, right? Not everybody gets that. I'm not doing a works mentality thing here. All right, the actual blessing.
The smell of my son is as the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and wine. Let peoples serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you.
Okay, so that blessing. Um, so it's interesting. Um, so it definitely should be compared, and we will compare it to the blessing that Esau gets um lower. So one, he gets the fatness of the earth, right? You get the fatness of the earth, whereas Esau's blessing down lower is away from the fatness of the earth. Um, Also, you'll be lord of over your brothers. Whereas the Esau's is you will serve your brother. Um, but what's Isaac thinking here? Because why is brothers plural? Um, Isaac only ever has one other kid, right? He doesn't end up getting married to someone else later and having a bunch of kids. At least as far as I can remember. I'm pretty sure that's not in there. Maybe. So it's just Esau. Um, so what is he thinking about here with the term brothers? Um, this definitely seems to be a a blessing that is not just for Jacob. It seems to be a blessing that is given like this is going to be the blessing that is kind of given to Israel as a nation. Um and you're going to end up seeing this kind of blessing passed down through um through Jacob's kids. And really what I think is in question is which is not like not how does this blessing apply to Jacob, but which of Jacob's kids does this blessing apply to? does it apply to the whole state of Israel, or does it apply to a particular uh, son? And this is going to end up being involved with kingship in Israel, and it's going to matter whenever you get to Israel um, splitting, right? Um, and who really is the rightful king of Israel. There's going to be a bunch of issues involved with firstbornness of Israel's of Jacob's sons going on. Um, but that cursed be everyone who curses you and blessed be everyone who blesses you. That statement is definitely applied, and I believe that statement was a part of the earlier covenant that came from God. So you see kind of the attempt to pass down the covenant of God through to a proper son. Um, but that statement definitely people in the modern day take that as applying to the whole state of Israel. Okay, we're going to keep going.
As soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, when Jacob had scarcely gone out from the presence of Isaac his father, Esau his brother came in from his hunting. He also prepared delicious food and brought it to his father. And he said to his father, "Let my father arise and eat of his son's game, that you may bless me." His father Isaac said to him, "Who are you?" He answered, "I am your son, your firstborn, Esau." Then Isaac trembled very violently and said, "Who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me, and I ate it all before you came? And I have blessed him. Yes, and he shall be blessed."
Okay, so we're going to talk about this a little bit. So, one, this first statement right here from Isaac seems to be uh, indicating, right? He indicates from right here that he's like, whoa, whoa, who was it that I blessed? And he doesn't seem to know that it was Jacob at this point. But also, you have this idea when we were talking about blessings is he seems to think that he can't just take it back, right? He can't just he can't just like Steve Harvey says the wrong name. He can't just be like, "Oh, I read off the wrong card." Boom. Like we would think that, "Oh, this should be a real easy fix." You just go, "Oh, right." It's just, "Oh, I read the will wrong," or something like that. Being like, Jacob, come back in here. Hey, you don't get all of that stuff. Actually, Esau is going to get it, right? We think this should be like a 2-minute fix, but they definitely don't seem to take it that way. And it's one of the things that, again, the commentary that I like to read on. He has this line about the worst aspect of all of this is they seem to regard the blessing as magical, as something detached from God's wisdom and will. But in giving the blessing, the most Isaac could do was recognize God's call and blessing on Jacob. Only God could truly bestow the blessing. Esau could receive the blessing from Isaac 100 times, but it only mattered if God in heaven honored it. That to me is a modern Christian applying their own interpretive lens to the story. No one in the no one in the story seems to think that it doesn't matter that Isaac was giving these blessings. They seem to in some way, I for a lack of a better word, they do seem to treat it as magical. And they seem to think that their words have power, and they seem to think that they can't just take it back. Which, by the way, is something that the Old Testament and the Bible seems to affirm, like repeatedly, of be careful with your words. You can't just take them back, right? It says be careful about your swearing. And you'll get stories later on about people making dumb swears, dumb oaths about like, I will sacrifice the next thing that walks through my door, or walks through my threshold to the Lord, and it ends up being, I forget who does this, but it ends up being his daughter, and he ends up sacrificing his daughter, and the kind of overarching lesson is, don't do that. That's really stupid. Um, I seem to think that I think that we should take this story kind of as it presents itself, and is that, yeah, they seem to think that this can't just be switched around. Um, and um, uh, the other thing that this commentary does is the commentary um tries to say that that Isaac was messing up here. So I'll take a little bit of time. I have a good spot to put this, so I'll go ahead and put it in. Um, so he has, strangely, Isaac insisted on giving the blessing to Esau, the one whom God did not choose. And he references Genesis chapter 25, 23, who despised his birthright and who married pagan wives. It seems Isaac rejected godly thinking and spiritual wisdom, and instead thought only of food and of the common man-centered ideas of might. Okay, I think that's a very weird take on this, because if you go back to Genesis 25, that little prophecy that's given there about the older shall serve the younger, that was never said to Isaac. That was said to Rebecca. Um, and so maybe you can assume that Rebecca told Isaac that, but we have no indication of that. And so I don't know why you would infer that Isaac is doing something wrong here. Now, if you are going to infer that Isaac is doing something wrong here by trying to give Esau the blessing, I would actually, if say, okay, if we're going to infer stuff, let's go ahead and infer that Isaac does know about that, does know that Jacob is supposed to get the blessing, and that Isaac is not supposed to get it. I think you actually have more of a case to infer that Isaac might be doing this whole thing on purpose. Now, why do I say that? Because of this next verse.
As soon as Esau heard the words of his father, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry, and said to his father, "Bless me, even me also, O my father." But he said, "Your brother came deceitfully, and he has taken away your blessing."
Now, all of a sudden, Isaac knows that it was Jacob. Nothing has changed here, so that suddenly he would figure out that it was Jacob. I mean, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. He seems to think in the previous statement, well, who was it then that brought in the food? It could have been anybody. And now all of a sudden he does think it is Jacob. So what's going on here? I don't know. One possibility, so basically there's two possibilities. One possibility is that Isaac knew it was Jacob, and Isaac was just kind of messing and using this situation, and he was being willfully blind and playing up his own infirmities so that he had an excuse for being tricked, because he wanted to be tricked so that he could fulfill God's plan. Or you have that he figured it out because of the nature of how blessings work. Can blessings only pass to sons, and therefore nobody else has motive? And so, since if it wasn't Esau, well, then it had to be Jacob. Um, I don't know. That involves the mechanics of blessings that I think simply we're out of that ancient context, and so we don't know how they would have been thinking about it to know how did Isaac all of a sudden know that this was Jacob? Um, but also, if he's just playing it up, why would he be so shocked and be trembling violently? Um, I don't know. I'm just saying that to say I see ambiguity in this aspect of the story. Um, and I don't exactly know how we're supposed to take it. I think the way that we're supposed to take it is he didn't he didn't know, he got tricked. Um, if he got tricked, it probably wasn't on purpose, although I see a way that you could read it as being on purpose. Um, but also that there are mechanics to blessings at play that we're not fully aware of. Um, but he doesn't think that he can just take it back. And also, Jacob was probably the only other candidate for getting the blessing. And so that's how he figured it out. That's what I think.
Esau said, "Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has cheated me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing."
And so Esau really sees these as two different things, but they seem to be two different things that are connected, as we've already talked about.
Then he said, "Have you not reserved the blessing for me?" Isaac answered and said to Esau, "Behold, I have made him lord over you, and all his brothers I have given to him for servants, and with grain and wine I have sustained him. What then can I do for you, my son?"
And so here we have a verse that seems to kind of contradict a little bit of what I said earlier about who are these brothers that he's given him as servants, since the only other brother is Esau. Esau never ends up being Jacob's servant. So what are these other brothers? Um, honestly, I don't know what it's talking about here.
Esau said to his father, "Have you but one blessing, my father? Bless me, even me also, O my father." And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. Then Isaac his father answered and said to him, "Behold, away from the fatness of the earth shall your dwelling be, and away from the dew of heaven on high. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you shall break his yoke from your neck."
Okay. Um, question. Is that a blessing? Um, I don't know. I don't know. It's definitely his response. It's Isaac's response to Esau begging for a blessing. Um, that little passage is never referred to as a blessing. It's just Isaac's answer. Um, it reads a little bit more as a curse, right? Away from the fatness of the earth, away from the dew of heaven on high. You're going to live by the sword. You're going to serve your brother. But there is kind of a glimmer of hope, which is you shall break his yoke from your neck. It's not going to be forever. You are going to get away from it. Um, which is interesting.
Now Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, "The days of mourning for my father are approaching. Then I will kill my brother Jacob." But the words of Esau, her older son, were told to Rebekah. So she sent and called Jacob, her younger son, and said to him, "Behold, your brother Esau comforts himself about you by planning to kill you. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice. Arise, flee to Laban my brother in Haran, and stay with him a while until your brother's fury turns away, until your brother's anger turns away from you, and he forgets what you have done to him. Then I will send and bring you from there. Why should I be bereft of you both in one day?" Then Rebekah said to Isaac, "I loathe my life because of the Hittite women. If Jacob marries one of the Hittite women like these, one of the women of the land, what good will my life be to me?"
Okay. So So we have a couple of interesting things here before we wrap up. Um, the days of mourning my father are approaching. Then I will kill my brother Jacob. Again, remember that timeline. They're not approaching. Isaac is going to live for another 40 years. Um, but we also definitely, whenever you're taught this story in Sunday school, you kind of get the idea of like Esau immediately like runs out and tries to kill Jacob, and that's the reason why Jacob runs away. And as we're going to see, that's kind of not what ends up happening. Uh, Esau actually is like waiting. And so there might actually be, if we go back to that chart that I showed earlier, um, if you kind of have a Sunday school understanding of this story, you might think that these things happen like uh immediately. And so therefore this story basically takes place like right here. Um but really this story could take place anywhere in this time frame. Um and Jacob could end up just running away later. Um Because again, Isaac's not dead yet, and Esau says that he's not gonna kill him yet. Um, so it doesn't have to be just right there. And as we're gonna end up seeing at the beginning of the next chapter, um, Jacob leaves with Isaac's permission. Isaac actually sends him away. Jacob doesn't just like flee in the night, um, randomly. Um, he leaves at the behest of his parents. Um, and the running away from Esau is kind like it's the driving reason, but it's not like the ultimate reason that really makes him go. Um, uh, but yeah, I think that's it. I think that's all I wanted to say about this chapter. Um, So we'll close it there. Again, if you have any comments or questions, can leave them as a comment on the video, or text me and ask me personally, or we can just discuss it all next week.